It took exactly 47 seconds for the $47 million figure to become more than a number. It became a gravity well, pulling two decorated political careers into the toxic orbit of Jeffrey Epstein's estate. The air in the Senate hearing room was already thin, but when the bank transfer document flashed on the screen, the silence achieved a new, permanent density. The room itself was an exercise in controlled power. It was the Senate Judiciary Committee Hearing Room 226, designed not for debate, but for cross-examination. The walls were paneled in dark, solemn cherry wood that absorbed the fluorescent glare bouncing off the long mahogany table. 20 pairs of eyes, belonging to senators and their counsel, stared down at the two witnesses seated side by side. Mr. Charles Bondi, former Deputy Chief of Staff for Administrative Operations, and Ms. Lena Patel, former Director of the Special Projects Bureau, SPB, an internal, self-funding division within the Department of Justice, DOJ. Both were known for their clinical efficiency and aggressive administrative expansion, but today, efficiency was secondary to survival. The atmosphere was thick with a specific Washington odor, the metallic scent of Newell suits and stale, recycled air, underlined by the high-frequency hum of broadcast equipment. The senator presiding, Senator Evelyn Warren, Democrat Massachusetts, sat centered. She wore no expression, but her posture, straight, almost rigid, suggested a coiled spring. Next to her, a single, pale yellow legal pad lay open, covered in precise, numbered notes. The witnesses sat perfectly still. Bondi, a man whose reputation was built on unshakable composure, adjusted his tie slightly, a tremor that traveled less than a quarter-inch but was immediately visible to the cameras. Patel, eyes fixed on the blank wall behind the committee, gripped the edge of the table. This was not a hearing about policy failure. It was about legal and constitutional arithmetic. The $47 million had been traced by a meticulous Senate investigation, moving through a complex, multi-layered series of offshore shell corporations, all now revealed to have been controlled by the executor of the Epstein estate, 3 months after his death. The money landed, not in a personal account, but directly into the operational budget of Patel's Special Projects Bureau. The question was not if the money was toxic, but why it was taken, and under what specific legal authority it was spent. The very existence of the SPB, which operated with near-zero congressional oversight, was now subject to the glare of a full constitutional review, centered on the Administrative Procedure Act, APA, which mandates specific reporting requirements for all government agencies. Senator Warren leaned into her microphone, the sound a soft, amplified sigh of static. She began with her opening statement, her voice low and even, utterly devoid of rhetorical flourish. Mr. Bondi, Ms. Patel. When you signed the appropriation directive establishing the SBB's operational account in fiscal year 2024, you certified compliance with Section 3302 of Title 31, United States Code, the Miscellaneous Receipts Statute. This requires that all money received for the government, unless specifically accepted by Congress, be deposited into the Treasury. The $47 million in question bypassed the Treasury and was deposited directly. My question is simple. Which specific exception, signed by the Congress of the United States, authorized the SPB to act as an independent financial sovereign? She paused. The only sound was the almost imperceptible click of her pen, waiting. The setup was complete. The legal vice was tightening. But the silence wasn't over yet. Senator Warren's query hung in the air. Which specific exception, signed by the Congress of the United States, authorized the SPB to act as an independent financial sovereign? The silence broke, not with an answer, but with a calculated maneuver. Mr. Bondi, drawing on his legal training, cleared his throat and leaned toward the microphone, his hands clasped on the polished mahogany. Senator, thank you. The Special Projects Bureau, the SPB, operates under a specialized directive authorized by the Attorney General's Administrative Order 2023A, specifically concerning matters of national security financial tracking. The $47 million, while originating from accounts now identified as hostile or illicit by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, was essentially a seizure. It was designated as Operational Capital, Asset Forfeiture Subaccount. Therefore, It falls under the existing exceptions detailed in 28 U.S.C. Section 524, c. 1, the Basic Asset Forfeiture Fund provisions. Bondi had deftly shifted the legal ground from the high standard of the miscellaneous receipts statute to the more flexible rules governing asset forfeiture. It was a common bureaucratic trick to use a broad, pre-existing mechanism to cover a highly specific, unauthorized action. Senator Warren remained still. She did not raise her voice, but her gaze, direct and unwavering, did not leave Bondi's face. Mr. Bondi, I am intimately familiar with 28 U.S.C. Section 524, c. 1. That provision permits deposited funds to be used for the payment of case-related costs, for storage, maintenance, and reward payments. It does not, Mr. Bondi, permit the establishment of an entirely new, quasi-covert operational arm of the DOJ. Furthermore, the statute mandates that all seized funds must be first deposited with the Treasury Secretary. My question, which you have not answered, is about the direct bypass of the Treasury. She then turned her attention to Ms. Patel, the operational director. Ms. Patel, as the director, you authorized the expenditure of this $47 million. My staff and I have identified $12. $3 million of that sum used for unbudgeted contracting fees with a single private intelligence firm, Akron Global LLC. Under what legal provision, not administrative order, did you utilize seized funds for an expenditure explicitly excluded from the narrow allowances of the Asset Forfeiture Fund? Patel's composure wavered for the first time. Her eyes flickered away from the wall to a spot on the table, a tiny, almost involuntary flinch. Her voice, usually sharp, was slightly strained. Senator, the contracting fees were necessary for time-sensitive intelligence gathering. Akron Global provided specialized data access tools that the Bureau's infrastructure lacked. This expenditure was certified internally as fulfilling the necessary expenses clause under the catch-all language of 5 U.S.C. Section 3109 for expert and consultant services. I see, Senator Warren said calmly, making a small, deliberate note on her pad. So you are arguing that an extraordinary $47 million direct deposit, skirting Title 31 regulations, was justified by the ordinary, prosaic language of the Expert and Consultant Services statute. She paused, letting the absurdity of the legal pairing hang in the air. Ms. Patel, let me ask you a precise, simple question. Did you or Mr. Bondi ever file a Suspicious Activity Report, SAR, with FinCEN regarding the source of this $47 million, as mandated by the Bank Secrecy Act, BSA, for transactions exceeding $10,000 when the source is highly suspect, specifically regarding the documented originator, Aurora Trust Corporation? Patel's jaw tightened. She looked at Bondi for a brief, imperceptible moment. The silence returned, heavier this time, carrying the weight of a legal obligation unfulfilled. But the evidence, once subpoenaed, always speaks. The pause, following the question about the Suspicious Activity Report, SAR, stretched taut. Ms. Patel's visible discomfort suggested the answer was a simple, legally fatal no. But Mr. Bondi intervened, seizing control of the narrative before the silence could solidify into an admission. Senator, the matter of an SAR is complex, Bondi stated, his voice regaining its practiced steadiness. The $47 million was not processed through a standard commercial bank interface. It was a rapid, direct transfer between two classified accounts, a holding fund operated by the Cayman-based Aurora Trust Corporation, and a specialized DOJ internal treasury subledger, Code 33. Since the transaction occurred between two functionally sovereign accounts, and was immediately flagged internally by the SBB's own compliance unit for national security threat assessment, the requirement for a public FinCEN SAR, designed for commercial reporting, was superseded by Presidential Directive 13921, Section 4B, which allows the Attorney General to temporarily waive reporting requirements for operations deemed critical threat mitigation. It was a bold, highly technical deflection, pitting a presidential directive against the foundational Bank Secrecy Act. Senator Warren acknowledged the complexity with a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of her head. She produced a single, stapled document from the stack before her, sliding it towards the witness table. Mr. Bondi, Ms. Patel. I am now entering into the Record Exhibit Delta 6, which is an internal SPB expenditure memo dated 3 days after the $47 million deposit. This memo, signed by Ms. Patel, allocates $1.8 million of the seized funds to an emergency upgrade of the Bureau's Section 702 Data Interception Gateway. Section 702 refers to the surveillance authority within the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA. She leaned in, her voice now a low, concentrated beam of inquiry. Section 702 allows the targeted surveillance of non-US persons located outside the United States. However, the use of unbudgeted, illicitly sourced funds, $47 million in Epstein money, to upgrade the technical apparatus is an administrative abuse. But that is not the contradiction. Ms. Patel, the SBB's operational mandate, which you submitted to the Senate Committee on Appropriations in January of this year, explicitly stated that the Bureau did not engage in any primary electronic surveillance, relying instead on data-sharing agreements with the FBI and NSA. The document is on page 14, line 7 of your sworn testimony. Patel's face went pale. The contradiction was direct and damning. Not only was she misusing seized funds, she was doing so to perform an activity that her Bureau had legally sworn it was not performing. You told Congress, under oath, that your Bureau was restricted from primary collection, Senator Warren pressed. But Exhibit Delta 6 shows you spent nearly $2 million of money tied to a deceased sex offender specifically to enhance your collection capabilities. This is a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, 31 U.S.C. Section 1341, which prohibits an agency from obligating funds in advance or in excess of an appropriation. More critically, Ms. Patel, this demonstrates that the SPB was operating outside of its statutorily defined purpose and, by extension, outside the due process protections afforded to every American citizen by the Constitution. The air felt electrified, heavy with the weight of the paper shuffling in front of the senator. The legal and constitutional lines were no longer blurred. They were being drawn in unforgiving black ink, directly across the careers of the two witnesses. But the precise cost of that contradiction was yet to be calculated. Senator Warren's accusation of operating outside the statutorily defined purpose hung heavy, forcing the witnesses into a corner where legal facts directly contradicted sworn testimony. Mr. Bondi, sensing the anti-deficiency violation was an institutional death blow, attempted one final, desperate defense of the SPB's operational scope. Senator, the SPB was a temporary, surgical unit created to address the systemic corruption and illicit network uncovered by the initial Epstein investigation. It operated under the implied powers doctrine necessary for the executive branch to execute its charge to protect national security. When we utilized the $47 million from Aurora Trust, we weren't appropriating, we were stabilizing. The intelligence community needed that FISA gateway upgrade to track those very funds before they could cause irreparable harm to U.S. financial security. The power was derived from the president's inherent authority, not a specific congressional statute. It was the classic invocation of executive overreach, claiming implied authority in the face of statutory limits. Senator Warren let him finish, then slowly picked up the pale yellow legal pad, now entirely filled with her meticulous script. Her voice dropped even lower, becoming intensely focused. Mr. Bondi, I am not asking about the wisdom of the president's power. I am asking about your due process obligation as an officer of the Department of Justice. The SPB used these unvetted funds to upgrade a FISA Section 702 collection tool. This tool, as confirmed by our review of the redacted warrants, began accidentally capturing communications involving American citizens, what the system terms U.S. person incidental collection. She pointed directly at him. When you spend illicit, unauthorized money to enhance a tool that collects U.S. person data without a warrant, you create a direct constitutional injury. Specifically, you violated the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment, which requires the government to operate with fairness and within the established law. By circumventing Title 31's appropriation rules and spending money outside the limits of the Asset Forfeiture Fund, you compromise the legality of every piece of data collected thereafter. Mr. Bondi, tell me, legally and precisely, when your Bureau's Compliance Counsel advised you on the risks of using the $47 million for surveillance enhancements, what was your specific citation, your legal justification, for believing the constitutional protection of the Due Process Clause could be suspended for a purely administrative expediency. The question was not political. It was a legal and ethical ultimatum. Bondi's face seemed to drain of color. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The camera lights, which had been a constant, steady white, began to flash rapidly as press photographers realized the gravity of the moment. The flashing strobes transformed the mahogany table into a dark mirror. He stammered, "Senator, we relied on the internal certification that the acquisition was." Senator Warren cut him off, her voice suddenly sharp, delivering the final legal blow. "You relied on internal administrative convenience to override a core, fundamental constitutional right? That is the definition of arbitrary government action, Mr. Bondi. You cannot use money tied to global financial crimes to fund secret surveillance, bypass the Treasury, and then claim a constitutional defense. The $47 million was toxic, and by using it, you poisoned the well of due process." The clock on the wall read 47 seconds, the exact duration of Bondi's panicked, exposed silence before his counsel gently touched his arm, advising him to invoke his right to silence. The collapse was complete, not a moral failing, but a documented legal exposure of institutional ignorance regarding the fundamental separation of powers and the protection of civil liberties. The constitutional failure was fatal. His career, and Patel's, ended in that soundless, strobe-lit surrender. But the media storm was only just beginning. The immediate aftermath of the 47-second silence was a furious, public scramble. As Mr. Bondi's counsel whispered the final, fatal advice, the Judiciary Committee room erupted into a controlled chaos of clicking cameras and hushed, aggressive conversations. Outside, the halls of the Senate complex were already choked with reporters live-streaming the blow-by-blow legal demolition. National media coverage was instantaneous and brutal. On CNN, legal analyst Dr. Eleanor Vance, a renowned constitutional scholar from Georgetown, delivered a concise and devastating assessment. This wasn't just a violation of administrative law. This was a violation of the rule of law itself. Senator Warren's argument is unassailable. They used funds from documented illicit sources, money that should have been segregated and reported under the Bank Secrecy Act, to fundamentally alter a surveillance program's capability. That act of unauthorized spending, tied to their false testimony regarding the SBB's operational scope, immediately violated the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment as it relates to privacy and legitimate governmental procedure. Constitutional scholars called it the most devastating Senate takedown since Watergate. For 4 to 7 seconds, America watched competence collapse. On the conservative news outlet, The Sentinel, anchor Michael Rhodes focused on the institutional decay. This $47 million wasn't just pocketed. It was injected into the bureaucracy to create a sub-agency accountable to no one, relying on money from the darkest corners of the global elite. The failure to report the funds, to file the mandated SAR, was not an oversight. It was an intentional act of concealment, suggesting a deliberate attempt to fund politically sensitive operations outside the purview of the House Appropriations Committee. Washington doesn't punish incompetence, it punishes exposure. And today, Bondi and Patel were exposed as agents of unaccountable power. Politically, the consequences were swift. The White House, already facing intense public scrutiny over the SBB's covert nature, issued a terse, two-sentence statement asserting that both individuals had resigned immediately and that their actions were independent administrative failures and not reflective of department policy. The Senate Judiciary Committee, with a rare flash of bipartisan unity, voted 18-0 to refer the testimony, the expenditure memo, Exhibit Delta 6, and the bank records pertaining to the $47 million to the Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General, OIG, for a full criminal investigation into potential violations of 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, false statements to Congress, and the Anti-Deficiency Act. The fallout extended beyond the individuals. Institutional trust was severely damaged. The entire Special Projects Bureau, SPB, was placed under immediate administrative freeze, with all intelligence collection halted pending a full compliance audit. The $47 million, now legally radioactive, was placed into a segregated, frozen account, pending civil forfeiture proceedings. The political objective of Senator Warren had been achieved, the destruction of the agency's credibility, based not on ideological attack, but on precise, documented violations of financial and constitutional law. The truth, in this case, was not abstract. It was written on a classified bank ledger. But the final cost of this crisis still needed to be tallied. The committee room emptied slowly, leaving behind only the cold, residual heat of the spotlights and the crumpled notes scattered across the floor. The immediate, electric energy of the legal confrontation gave way to the heavy, bureaucratic process of dismantling a political career. The $47 million had achieved its purpose, not to fund an operation, but to become a toxic marker, defining the moment two officials placed operational secrecy above constitutional mandate. Ms. Patel and Mr. Bondi had miscalculated on a fundamental level. They had viewed the law as a series of hurdles to be circumvented with administrative orders and legal technicalities, failing to grasp the constitutional bedrock upon which those rules were built. Their mistake was not in failing to report a large sum of money, but in attempting to justify the misuse of that money with a claim of executive prerogative that directly compromised the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause. They had treated a fundamental right, the right to fair and legally consistent government action, as a negotiable item in the pursuit of intelligence gathering. The Department of Justice's OIG investigation, launched immediately after the Senate referral, was not difficult. The internal documents, particularly Exhibit Delta 6, provided a clear evidentiary path. The failure to adhere to 31 U.S.C. Section 1341, the Anti-Deficiency Act, was a matter of mathematics, spending funds that were never appropriated by Congress, regardless of their source. The failure to file the Suspicious Activity Report, SAR, was a clear violation of the Bank Secrecy Act. The legal argument, so complex in the heat of the hearing, boiled down to a simple, unassailable truth. Public officials must adhere to the law, especially when handling illicit funds and engaging in surveillance. Weeks later, the SPB was fully dissolved. Its specialized functions were returned to the FBI's established Financial Crimes Unit, ensuring that all future asset forfeitures and surveillance tools would be vetted by the Treasury Department and reviewed by the FISA Court. The case became a permanent, documented warning within the Washington establishment. Financial secrecy, when married to covert operations, always leads to exposure under the relentless light of constitutional accountability. The political costs of this systemic failure far outweighed the operational gains of the $47 million. Mr. Bondi and Ms. Patel faded from the public eye almost instantly, their carefully curated resumes rendered irrelevant by the single, inescapable fact of the $47 million ledger entry and the 47-second silence. Their names would now be footnotes in legal textbooks on administrative overreach. They never faced a jury, as both agreed to settlements that included severe financial penalties and permanent bans from federal employment. The episode served as a quiet reckoning for Washington, a philosophical lesson disguised as a congressional hearing. The law does not distinguish between good intentions and bad. It only judges consistency, transparency, and adherence to foundational principles. Some careers end in scandal. Theirs ended in silence. Washington doesn't punish ignorance. It replaces it.